Welcome to the Digital Digest, your weekly breakfast of insights, tips and tricks, and general information that will help anyone trying to move forward in this digital world of accounting. This show is sponsored by AdvanceTrack. For anyone that doesn't know who they are, they're probably the leading outsourcers in the UK, and of course, have just launched their pod sourcing concept into the UK market. So check them out. Also brought to you, of course, by the Digital Disruptors, and we are always looking to push the boundaries of the digital accounting space. I'm your host for this episode, and we're going to be talking about the challenges around transformation and moving between one system to another, and what you need to be looking out for, and of course some of the systems that are there to help you. I'm lucky enough, of course, to be joined by Ryan to help us go through the details. So let's go, Ryan.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Well, look, I love talking about digital transformation. So let's see what we can dive into for the next 30 minutes ish.
Yeah.
All right. So I think our focus this episode will be on a specific tool, one that you can use to help move data from one business to another. And you can do it many ways, moving data. You can just do it open balances. You can do it as monthly journals. So you can do it from a reporting perspective. But something a lot of businesses like to do is move their transactional information, if they can, so that they, in theory, don't need anything from their old system, but they can look back at any point and identify why a transaction's occurred, along with it, or just what's happened in the interactions with a customer or supplier. So there's lots of requests I get, which is like, oh, we're on this system, but can we move to a different system, and can we move our data with it? And so one tool that we tend to use quite a lot, and I think is well known in this industry, is Move My Books, which is I don't know, it feels like it's been around forever, John.
It does feel like it's been around forever. It's I think it has been almost around forever. Which when we're talking about forever, of course, we're talking about sort of as long as the cloud accounting sort of space has been bumbling along for, I guess. I think one point, maybe just before we talk in detail about Move My Books, which I think is really important, is that increasingly one of the things that we are seeing is that historically when we were moving clients maybe off desktop software to cloud software, that desktop software typically had a license that just ran forever, or you had a license that even if it expired, say at the in the end of March, you still had access to the data. Increasingly, as people are moving away from, say, one SaaS product to another SaaS product, the only way to get access to your data typically is to maintain that subscription. And so this concept of being needing to be able to move data in bulk from one system to another is probably becoming more and more prevalent than maybe it used to be. And of course, there's lots of reasons for that. The need to be able to go back over 6 years worth of history for HMRC purposes, the record keeping requirements that organizations will have as well. And, those aren't just 6 years in some instances. And if you've used the file system in products like Xero, for example, and then moving away from it, if you've got things like insurance docs on there, you need to keep them for a much longer period of time. So you need to be very aware as an advisor and as a business owner what your document retention requirements are from a legal perspective, as well as for other compliance matters. But yeah, I think Move My Books was probably one of the very first products, I guess, to get into the Xero ecosystem, and a product specifically designed to help Xero, really, or Xero users or Xero accountants, to kind of ramp up their user base by making it easier to take. I think, I mean, I might get this wrong, but I think their first connection was to take data out of Sage 50 and moved it to Xero at the time. It's then become much more expansive since then. But yeah, I mean, if Xero's I don't know, 17, 18, 19 years old now in the UK, I guess Move My Books must be a year or so behind that. It's been around for a very long time. And I remember the early iterations of Move My Books, which it definitely wasn't quite as slick a process as you experience nowadays. It was it was sometimes a little bit challenging, but definitely helped. And for an accountancy practice that's not particularly familiar with moving from one system to another, having a product that you could literally just more or less plug into and it'll go away and do the data transformation for you is a lifesaver, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you. We are seeing more businesses that are looking to having to consider, well, how do they access their old data? Because they don't want two subscriptions going. But I find it's not just SaaS products now, right? Because so many of the more traditional systems have gone to a subscription-based model. So as soon as you turn off that subscription, they cut off your access. which is a frustration. Obviously, if you've got backups, you've got something there you can restore, but then you have to find someone that can do that for you if you've not got the system anymore. So it becomes a bit of a headache. But look, the Move My Books has gone through different iterations over time of where it's focused moving data to. I believe at some point you can move data into QuickBooks Online, but that doesn't seem to be present at the moment. I think they've moved away from moving to QuickBooks Online, and now their focus is moving just to Xero or to Sage. But you can move from many different systems. So you can move from Sage 50, Sage Accounting, Xero, Cashflow, Free Agent, QuickBooks Online, QuickBooks Desktop, if that's still even possible nowadays to access that. So you've got some more common systems you can move from, but there are limitations. There are lots of other systems that Move My Books doesn't cover that businesses are on. If you're, for example, in the agricultural sector, a lot of the time you're going to be on an ag product that is not covered by Move My Books, and you need to explore other avenues. So it has its place. It is something that is commonly used, but and it is a tool that has improved its reliability, its consistency, but there's always little nuances that businesses need to be aware of. And if you're not doing digital transformation all the time, and I think, John, like for me and you, Move My Books has become such a part of our arsenal that we probably don't actually think about, like, actually when you're coming into this, there's probably things you don't know and you can still mess up.
Yes, so yeah, absolutely.
It's probably worth diving into some of those nuances, those challenges that you can experience with Move My Books, and why you still need a process that wraps around it, not just throw it into the tool, out comes perfection, which I have experienced, but only once with it. So
only once. Oh, it sounds like your sex life, Ryan.
Pretty much, yeah. So yeah, look, John, do you find that, say they're a client that's on one of those systems, Sage 50, Xero, etc., and then want to move to something else, is your go-to first consider, can we use Move My Books, and then from that, like, what are the other options that we need to consider if a business needs something that Move My Books can't do? Is that generally your approach?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, it makes so much sense to go to Move My Books because they have got this history of doing it. Oh gosh, I can't even speak, Ryan. So excited about this. If you're moving between certain systems as well, there are incentives that Move My Books have received from vendors, like Xero, like Sage, and others, to encourage you to help move to their products, and so you can quite often convert a couple of years worth of data for free when moving between certain products. And again, when you kind of look at that and go, well, it's either going to take me a day or a couple of days to move this data, or I can just basically upload it into the system for free and get it done, probably much quicker than I can do anyway. It's almost a bit of a no-brainer. As you say, there are limitations, and Move My Books does have a list of known limitations in the system. I would also say that actually we came across a limitation that's not listed on their system the other day when we did a Sage 50 to Xero conversion, and they didn't convert the X references across to Xero, which they used to do, because I remember being able to do that a few years ago, and they've since stopped that. Apparently they stopped that because of customer feedback. That customer feedback didn't come from me, because I still want that data coming across, and they've stopped it. So that was an interesting one that we literally experienced in the last month. And we've now had to go back and sort of rectify that, because when we were doing our post conversion data checks, we suddenly realized that this hadn't come across, and then had to sort of go off and rectify that ourselves. But yeah, I mean, there are a few alternatives to Move My Books, but often that's usually the go-to for me, and I've had pretty much a really good experience with using that product across the board, even within those known limitations of things like issues around FX balances, because there's a challenge when moving stuff with FX that they can't move the historic FX balances, so everything comes across in your base currency, which is typically sterling in the UK, and there are some other limitations there as well, but FX is the one that probably I come up against most often, and as long as you're aware of that, and the client's not too concerned about seeing lots of FX variances historically, and when they go back, then then that's all good.
Yeah, I mean, so process wise, let's talk a bit through this. Say you've got, I'm going to go the traditional route. So I'm going to go, say you're Sage 15, you're going to a cloud system such as Xero. There are things that are going to affect that movement, but essentially what you need is a backup, or you need to download something onto your system that can connect directly into your Sage data. Those are the two approaches. If you've got a backup, you feed it into their system. The connection one is the faster, because you basically pull it in, it sucks the data out and starts churning away. You need to allow it time. It's going to ingest the information, it's going to process it, it's going to kind of repackage it, and it's going to push it into the new system. So whenever we're doing this, we always start a conversion on a Friday afternoon, because then we know by the morning we're going to have a system that we can work with. So we always ask by midday on the Friday, make sure you're giving the backup. We can throw it in. We can see if it's kind of ingest it correctly, because you can have issues with backups. They can be corrupted, or there could be some missing data, or even the way it's tried to take the file can go wrong at times. So we kind of put it in, we kind of give it an hour, we check it. If it's progressing well, we're like, okay, it's gonna do something. We're gonna get something out at the end of this, and then we kind of let it go. And then on the Monday, we pick it up and we go through and basically review it to see, has it done what we'd expect it to do. We check the normal things such as, does the balance sheet balance? Does it match the Sage backup? And then we can kind of go through other areas such as contacts, etc. Do you do a similar process for that, John?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that Friday evening or Friday afternoon conversion and picking it up Monday is very familiar to me. I mean, we have had instances where the conversions now are so quick that it can happen within a matter of hours, and which is very exciting. We equally, if you've got a lot of data that you're moving from one system to another, it will take a little bit longer, because clearly it's got to plow through the data. I mean, I guess the question for you, Ryan, from me is like, what's your preference? Do you prefer for clients or for your team to clean the data in like Sage or in the desktop product before you move it, or do you prefer to clean it afterwards? In terms of, if you look at, say, Sage, for example, contacts will have if you've got a supplier that you also sell to, you will have two contact records for that, and obviously when you move that to, say, a product like Xero, that becomes a unified contact. Do you prefer to try and cleanse any old data out of Sage before you move it, or do you tend to look at it in Xero? My preference is Xero, because I find it's easier to work in that system, but sometimes we do push that back to clients and get them to clean it up in Sage before conversions.
Yeah, so we always advise you should do a bit of a cleanse, but don't go too far. And the reason for this is there's, as you said, some nuances with Move My Books that even if you cleanse your data, it's still going to pull some of it across. So an example of that is archive contacts. Many times clients have gone through, they've archived their contacts in their system. It's then pulled across and all the archive contacts are in place, and they feel, why have I spent all this time doing it? It's all there in the new system. And that's because, if they've got transactions in place, if there's been some interaction, it needs to bring it across. So now that it's present. So even if you are hiding them, they just reappear again. So what the normal things we ask them to tidy is check that your age payables and receivables match your trial balance figure, because in some systems you can do something that prevents that happening. That causes a big problem. Make sure you've got supplier names for anything that is, or customer names for anything that is in that ledger, because that can be a problem. Make sure your bank is fully reconciled up to the date we want to convert. Make sure your VAT return is filed as well. And the main thing, the thing we always focus on, which is we find critical, is try and do the conversion just after you file a VAT return, because when you move it, all your VAT transactions become unreconciled. So if you are doing it partway through a VAT period, be a month or a quarter, and you've got backdated transactions, it means that those transactions are now going to be kind of muddied or buried in historical transactions, and trying to lock it down in the new system before you then process future returns is a pain in the butt. So the number one thing we do is go try and do it at the end of just when you filed a VAT return. The rest of it doesn't matter too much. Doesn't have to be a year end, especially as we bring historical transactions across. So don't worry too much about that, but do try and focus on filing a VAT return. But as you said, we tend to focus on tidying mostly in Xero, because it also enables us to pick up any of those slight oddities that come through from Move My Books, such as, and I've seen it before, where the data's not great in the original system, trying to get the trial balance to match. There can be lots of journals around within different kind of suspense accounts moving things, and it looks a bit untidy at times in the new system, especially if someone wants to go in and change a historical transaction. It can then create a now suspense account that was hidden or archived, and it just makes things very challenging. So one of the things I love to do is try and lock the data, but then, you know, if you're in Xero trying to allocate payments, etc., it just causes a bit of a problem. So
yeah.
And
I mean, we quite often find as well that if you've got a business that's using things like payments on account, they don't always get allocated particularly well. And obviously, Xero in particular as a system prefers those payments on account to be allocated to a particular transaction, invoice, etc. And so you can quite often spend a reasonable amount of time just cleaning up ledgers where those kind of things manifest as well. Which is good. I think it's good in terms of it encourages the business owner to think in a slightly different way when they move from one system to another. So quite often we'll leave some of those in the pot kind of to be looked at and reviewed as part of the training process.
Yeah, but I guess let's focus. We touched on it a few times now, but let's focus on some of the nuances inside the system, some of the things that you need to be aware of. There, as you said, there's a long script on the Move My Books website. You can dive down, see what system you're on, what you're moving to, and see all the things you should be aware of. But as you said, critically, you've got a nuance around foreign exchange. So it's going to convert it into your base currency before it pushes it into the system. You're not going to be able to see what the original currency was and the new currency. That does throw out some discrepancies, and they kind of dump that into a foreign exchange account. So it's something to be aware of. It's not going to be perfect. As you say, you've got these thing with contacts that you will have a supplier and a customer, and you may want to merge that inside Xero. Those can sometimes get a bit muddied, especially if you've got like a holding customer and kind of sub customers or suppliers. That can get a little bit confusing when you move across from system to system. You have to pay extra for departments that are in Sage, but you can move those across into tracking categories inside Xero. You also you only get, and it says 2 years, like for some for free, but it's not 2 years. It's current year and 1 historical year. So if you're 1 month into your current year, you're only getting a month and a half, a year and a month worth of data. So just be aware of that. So there's lots of things, just as from my experience, that you come across. It becomes second nature when you're doing this and you're having conversations with the client. But if you're doing this for the first time, you need to read up on it. You need to make sure you're comfortable, and you need to make and do your checks afterwards. But is there any other nuances you come across, John?
The only other thing I've picked up, and this has happened a couple of times, is if you've got a client that's got a little bit excitable, particularly in Sage, and ended up dating a transaction way off in the future, that gets picked up on your conversion dates, and then it completely throws everything out. So, in fact, again, we've had one in the last month where I think there was something dated in 2030, I think it was. And so as soon as you start the upload process of the data, it starts looking at it going, oh, you've got a transaction in 2030. So it immediately jumps forward, and that's your conversion date. It's like, okay, hold on, I need to go back and have a look at Sage, then we'll figure out what it is. And actually, as it happened, that was a transaction that had been posted incorrectly, but then been deleted in Sage. But because it still appears on the audit trail, it's still been picked up in the data when the data review happens. So it doesn't come across into Sage. It doesn't come across into Xero when you do the transformation, but it had been picked up as a date, and so it was giving us some slightly erroneous dates when we initially looked at it. So it just took us a minute just to go back to the Sage data and just double check. Like I say, the only other one that I've picked up very recently is about those references, where you've got the X references or whatever it used to be called. I think it's now just reference, not necessarily being brought across. And so what happens is you get the invoice number duplicated in the invoice number field and then in the reference field in Xero. And that didn't used to happen. You used to get a different mapping there. The only other one that I'm aware of is that there's some weird, funny stuff. If you're moving from free agent to Xero, there's some weird, funny stuff around corporation tax and the calculations that come across from there. So you do have to specifically check that. But I guess there's probably not that many organizations moving between those two products at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think with where they are. And I think the other thing to be aware of is you can't always move from one subscription type into another. There's limitations on that. So normally it's the higher subscription types. If it's like into Xero or from the likes of QuickBooks Online. But you can always then change it, downgrade, etc., depending on transaction volume once you're in. So you may need to pay a little bit higher subscription and downgrade, but you can always do it into a trial license. There's nothing stopping you doing that.
I think one of the other things that we've picked up as well, particularly where we've picked up maybe a conversion that a client has tried to do or a business has tried to do themselves and then got unstuck, is they've subscribed to Xero. They've started setting up things in Xero, and then they've added something like maybe contacts, or they've maybe, I don't know, added a bank account or something like that, and then that just completely breaks the process from a Move My Books point of view. And then what you have to do is either you have to speak nicely to Xero to get that subscription reset fully, or you just basically just do the easy thing, which is hop from one to the other and cancel that subscription and move across. But it is slightly problematic for businesses who maybe have spent a couple of hours setting things up and putting logos in and all those kind of things without really realizing the consequences. So that's just one thing just to be aware of, because it doesn't happen very often, but if you've kind of meddled in Xero beforehand, then you've got no chance of being able to move the data across.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Something that I guess I forget because it's so second nature now, but you need a blank license. And there's been so many conversations with clients where like, oh, well, we want to start processing from the start of the month. Can we do that and then move across the historical information later? No, you can't do that with Move My Books. You can do that if you're doing a manual process, but that becomes horribly cumbersome as well. I always advise pick a date, do the transfer. And the only time that can't happen is where you are constantly having to do invoicing and sending that out in a live system. And you're either going to have to pick a day, do your invoicing, keep track of that, and then replicate that in the new system, or you're going to have to try and probably pay a bit more and do a manual process with a bit of risk that things can go wrong. But that's where you need to speak to an expert. If you've got these challenges, talk through what they are, work out actually from experience what is the best approach. But because Move My Books is a tool out there, if you are moving from one system to another, it does mean that you can do this yourself. If you are going to do it, though, my advice is give it a go, but do it on a trial license. See how the data comes across, see if you're happy with it, or you can tidy it yourself. If not, and you failed after one attempt, or there's something's going wrong, then reach out and get an expert to do it. We have lots of clients who just, one, don't have the time, don't have the expertise to check, and are happy to pay a fee to make sure their data's correct, because in the end, there's a lot of risk about it going wrong. If something goes wrong and you're working on it for a couple of months without realizing, unpicking that is just impossible. It's such a headache that I don't like it. I've come across it before. I just try and prevent it ever happening.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is that like any conversion, things like just a simple thing, or it seems a simple thing, but getting the VAT right, like you want to be, as an organization, when you've moved between systems, you want to just be able to go, right, that first VAT return that I do, I know that it's reliable, it's going to be accurate, I've not got any concerns about transactions from a previous period that have been missed or something like that. So it's those kind of things that are just really, really, really important to have. And again, you want to have that reliability. If you have moved a lot of data, that let's say you get to an end of a period and you run a P&L report, you want to know that when you're looking back over those other P&L numbers, that everything stacks up and it's exactly as it was in the other system. If it's not, then you're going to have no confidence at all in the system that you've moved to, and that's a really big thing in my experience for new users moving between systems. It's confidence. It's being reassured that when you look at the data and look at the systems and what you're doing and inputting into that system, it's reliable, it's consistent, all of those good stuff. And so the reporting part of it and being able to do the kind of like the standard functions that you've had, and even simple things like being able to run a customer statement off and being confident that when you look at it, it's got the right invoices outstanding and it's got the right payments allocated against things. That might sound really basic, but you can screw that up quite badly if you don't get things right in the systems. And that, I guess, one of those things that I think you alluded to previously was that Move My Books will sometimes pick up transactions with this kind of like no name or a default kind of reference or a customer name on there sometimes, particularly if it can't pick up something from the source system that it's moving from. And so that does have to be unpicked sometimes, and you just have to drill down into that and go, right, what is that transaction for? What's it relate to? Particularly if you're moving to a system like Xero or QuickBooks, where those contact records are really, really, really important, because you, even if there's this, the smallest of typos between a name, you can't then allocate a payment on account to an invoice, or you can't allocate a credit note to an invoice, even if you get one letter out on a name. And it's just those kind of things that you need to go through with a fine-tooth comb and tidy up. One of the things that we use for that quite often is that we'll also plug in what was Xavier Analytics, so Dex Precision now, and that just helps us also just have another run through of the data. We tend to use that quite often as well with our clients post implementation, because then we can just keep a bit of a view on, particularly if they've got their own finance team, so we're not going to do the bookkeeping, particularly so we can just help them make sure that they're keeping the bookkeeping quality up, and that we're, where we're locking periods and things, that we've got confidence over that. And just gives us an extra tool to monitor progress effectively over a period of time.
Yeah, completely agree. Change management is probably the biggest thing in any of this, and confidence is a critical factor of that. As soon as you start losing confidence, people don't like change, so they just push back, and then it's just like, why are we moved? Well, yeah, I can understand that if you're feeling pain in the new system. Let's make it as seamless as possible. But let's take a few minutes at the end to, I guess, touch on where you can't use Move My Books and what are the other options. So the simplest thing is do open balance migration. But realistically, you only want to do that at the start of a year, because if you do that partway through the year, when it comes to your end of year accounts preparation, your accountant is going to be working on 2 different systems, and they're going to really struggle to get the right figures across that. It's going to become a lot more inefficient for them. And realistically, they're going to charge you more. If they're not charging you more, they should have. They've just absorbed the cost themselves. So my advice, if you're doing opening balance, is only do that at the start of a year. If you're going mid-year, either use a tool like Move My Books, or use a data migration specialist that can move your transactional data pretty much manually. They usually do this via API plugins. They ingest your data from where it comes from via Excel exports. They link it all together, they push it in, and they can replicate the bank reconciliation, all the allocations of payments against contacts, and get your trial balance and profit loss to match. The other benefit of this, and I always say to people to do this every time they migrate, is when you're reviewing your chart of accounts and you're changing the structure to make it work more effectively in a new system, which I would advise on any move, that they can then realign all of your historical transactions against the new structure. If you're doing a Move My Books process, they're just going to replicate it. Then you have to change the chart of account structure. Then you have to move things around, and it just is a bit more cumbersome. So if you're doing it through a data migration specialist, you can essentially get them to do all that as part of the process. It's a higher fee. One, it's not complimentary. It doesn't come as part of the Move to Xero, where Move My Books will cover the first 2 years. There is a cost to it, but it doesn't matter what system you're on, and it means that you can completely restructure it. And we at Scrum and SB Digital have always worked with what is now Migrate My Accounts. So Florentina Sandu now was formerly DAS Dorset. We have used other contractors in the past. That's been a horrific experience. Since working with Florentina, I've got full faith, and it's actually quite nice to have that we're going to get good service and the data is going to move across effectively. Do you use like similar kind of process on this, John, when you're assessing or talking to clients about what they should move, how they should move across, and do you use consultants to help with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's usually the first conversation that we have in terms of the process. Even before we've sort of got into the depth of like what system should we be moving to and everything else. I mean, that initial discovery in terms of what system are they on currently, and then what does that mean in terms of their options about moving to another system? Because if it is, let's say it is a move to Xero, if they're not on one of the products that Move My Book supports, then clearly you're already outside of the remit of where you can go there. And then you've got a conversation about what is it that they want to do. And if they do want to move a lot of data, then clearly that's going to take a lot of time. It can be quite costly. That's where people like Florentina is really helpful, because she does have experience of moving particular systems and being able to do that at scale, and frankly has the expertise that we don't have to be able to do that effectively. there are other things like, there are other options like, there's products like MMC Convert, Xero, and some of the other products do have their own conversion tools as well that you can do. And equally, as you say, sometimes it might be justifiable that you do just want to start with open balances at a particular point in time, and move like that, and just start with the trial balance. Obviously, that's relatively straightforward, but also has its own implicit limitations in terms of historic data. You've got a nice clean starting point, but you've got nothing against which to report on, and all those kind of things. So that conversation is quite nuanced with clients, and it's really important for them to understand what the implications are, because there are cost implications whichever route you go down, whether that's the cost of moving the data, or whether that's the cost of retaining access to your previous system, or whether you've got this kind of hybrid, and then you've got to figure out what you want to do. And as we said right at the top, in terms of data retention, these are things, that if you just move opening balances today, then you might still have to maintain access to that historic data for the next 5 to 6 years, which is a significant chunk of time, and it's not something that's easily forgotten, I guess.
No, I think you're right on all of that, and I think what we'll probably do on future episodes is touch into some of these other approaches, so that you can balance, which is the best way. But yeah, I think it's probably a good place to pull this together, wouldn't it, John?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right there. So, as you say, perfect time to wrap up this week's show. Hopefully this episode has provided you with valuable insights that you can take forward. Please do check out the show notes for links to Digital Disruptors and our wonderful sponsor, AdvanceTrack, plus anything and anyone we might have referenced in the show. If you want to ensure you catch future episodes, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure that you look out for the release on a Thursday morning. And of course, Ryan and I will hopefully be here next week to speak to you on another topic of all about the challenges in our digital transformation space. But for now, that's it.
Thanks all. Nice one, John.
Oh dear.